He saw that whatever wealth and riches he had, that he would have to go through this just like everybody else, and it troubled him deeply. Hello, welcome to Brixton Sri Ratna Dharma Night. Tonight we're going to be continuing in a series of talks and discussions around this book that was written by Sangha called The Three Jewels. And we're looking specifically at the stories around the Buddha, the first of the jewels. And in the last recording, Amra Pushpa was talking about the Bodhisattva and the lives of the Bodhisattva leading up to the eventual birth of, and particularly talking about our current Buddha in our current era, Gautama the Buddha, and how in his previous incarnation he met the former Buddha, Dipankara, and how between meeting him and his current presence in our time period, he was practicing the perfections of a bodhisattva, or the paramitas of a bodhisattva. So now we're going to come forward, if you like, into the current period, if you like, and talk about the Buddha that we know, the Buddha that was born 2,500 years ago. And that is a long time historically, isn't it? We don't know a lot about people who lived that time ago. We lose records of people. And also, the Buddha himself was someone who attained this state of enlightenment, which is obviously a very high achievement and something which is very difficult to describe. So to some extent, in the book, Sangha says how the grasping a historical perspective on the Buddha is quite difficult. Nevertheless, he has come up with quite a lot of information which is sort of interesting. The Buddha, as we know, was born Siddhartha Gautama, and it's thought that he was born in or around 563 BCE. And Siddhartha, his first name, means the accomplished one, and his family name is Gautama. And his father was named Shuddhadana, and his mother was Mayadevi. And they belonged to a clan called the Shakyans. And it was quite a large group of people, about 1 million people, and they lived in an area of land, something like 2,000 square miles. And they lived in the northeast of modern-day India. In fact, the northern part of the Shakyan territory would have moved into Nepal, what is today Nepal, but around about northeast India, southern Nepal. That's where the land was that they owned. And the Shakyans were largely, predominantly, they were an agricultural people. And they weren't a monarchy. There were monarchies in the area around them, and the Buddha himself met a number of kings in his lifetime. But the Shakyans were in fact, they elected an assembly of people who would govern their affairs, and it's believed that either at the time of the Buddha's birth or nearabouts that time, his own father Shuddhadana had been elected the president of that council. So his family were a very prominent family, and they were a very wealthy family. Shortly after the Buddha was born, unfortunately his mother died, and he was brought up by his maternal aunt, Mahaprajapati, and she too was a wife of his father. And it's believed that he was well educated. We don't believe he could read or write, but he was trained in probably what is quite a elitist type of education in terms of clan traditions, Brahmanic law, learning his ancestry, and in sports and sort of nightly exercises. And at the time of his youth also, he had an important, as Bhante calls it, or sorry, Sangha calls it, important mystical experience, where he was watching his father ploughing, and he was lying beneath a rose apple tree watching his father ploughing, And he found himself getting into a very, very pleasant mental state, very, very high state of consciousness, where he felt very peaceful, pure, blissful. And that was an important experience later on in his life, and we'll come to that in a bit. And he himself described himself as a delicate youth, and he said he had the finest of clothes, and he was perfumed, and he wore cosmetics. He was lavishly attended, and he could choose, where he lived depending on the season. He could choose the appropriate palace to live in according to the season. So, to all accounts, he had basically anything he could want as a young man, and also as a young, he's believed that he was married with a son. That's not sure, but it's lots of accounts do relate that. But what all accounts relate is that he was troubled. He was troubled by his awareness of the suffering that in human experience, and that's sort of abbreviated in the four sites or three of the four sites is birth, age, sickness, aging, and death. He saw that whatever wealth and riches he had, that he would have to go through this just like everybody else, and it troubled him deeply, so deeply that he decided to forgo all the luxuries of his home life, to go forth into the homeless life, to swap his rich clothing for the clothes of a beggar, cut off his long hair, and go begging for food and seeking instruction. And this was a practice which was common at the time. Spiritual people seeking spiritual growth would leave home. Perhaps it was extreme for someone in his position to do that, but nevertheless, that's what he did. And he walked off, and he searched for a teacher, and he found a sage who taught him all he knew. Very quickly, he mastered all the teachings, and the sage offered to share the leadership of his group of followers with him. But the Buddha didn't accept that because he still didn't see the answer to this suffering that he saw in humanity. And he went to find another sage who was even more renowned. And a similar story occurred. He mastered the teachings very quickly. He was offered the leadership of the group. He didn't see that as bringing his answer. So he left that sage too. And then he followed... he decided to follow a practice of austerity, again, which is a common practice at the time he lived, where people would basically mortify the flesh to try to liberate their spirit or their soul, and they would practice these austerities, which would be very extreme, sort of starvation of themselves. They would expose themselves to the heat without any protection. They would hold themselves in awkward positions for long periods of time, etc. And he did this in the company of 5 fellow ascetics, but he was the acknowledged leader because of the severity with which he treated himself. And in fact, he was so severe with himself that he became renowned and quite renowned for the strictness of his practice. But it got to a point after about 6 years where he decided that he almost died, and he could see that if he carried on the way he was carrying on, that in fact he would just die without finding the answer to his problem. And it was about this time when he was reflecting on this that he recalled this incident we spoke about earlier about his mystic experience as a child, and that type of conscious experience of bliss and purity and clarity. And he wondered if he meditated and bore that in mind, whether that would lead him to a solution. And he determined to sit in meditation. And I think the way it's described is he'd sit in meditation until he either achieved enlightenment or died. So he was very, very committed to this particular attempt at finding the answer to his troubled mind. And So he sat down beneath a peepal tree, which is near Uruvela, which is a town in Magadha, and it's by the Narangara River. These are all real places, and he sat down to meditate, and he had a number of experiences through the night where he achieved very high states of consciousness, and where he saw his former lives. So Amrapushpa was talking in the last recording about his former lives, but he could see back through his former lives, and he could go back as far as he wanted to. And then not only that, but he could see the lives of other people, and he saw how when they moved from one life to the next, their position, their conditions of that life were influenced by the way they behaved in their former lives. So it brings in the sort of concept of karma. So very, very, very profound experiences he had, and eventually he reached a state where he saw he saw the if you like the nature of reality, and he saw that it's our craving for existence which leads us to live from one life to the next, which causes us to go round and round in this circle of birth, sickness, aging, and death. So he found the solution to his problem, and that's when he achieved his enlightenment. So after his enlightenment, he decided to he assimilated his experience. It's obviously a very profound experience, and he said for several weeks he spent this time around the peepal tree, and on the fifth week he decided to bring his understanding of how to attain enlightenment to mankind, even realizing how difficult that would be. And the first people he decided to teach were the ascetics that he'd left behind. And after some accommodation of bringing him coming back, they were going to not going to receive him in a very friendly way, because they felt he'd gone to lead a rich or luxurious life. But they saw in his bearing that there was, that something had changed in him, and they gave him time, and he taught them the middle way, the Four Noble Truths, and the Eightfold Path, very basic, well-known teachings of the Buddha, and that particular teaching was known as the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma. And before long, all five ascetics had become enlightened, and this went on. And he met other people, and he taught them, and they became enlightened. And before long, he grew a group of what's said to be 60 people plus himself, who were enlightened and were determined to spread the Dharma. And he set everybody off in their separate directions to preach the Dharma. And he explained that there are many people out there with little dust on their eyes, but that they wouldn't realize in the enlightened state unless they heard the Dharma. So it's important that they went out and taught. And he himself went into the town of Uruvela, and he converted. There was a number of sort of conversions, if you like, from other spiritual beliefs to the following of the Dharma, and he converted 1,000 fire worshippers to the Dharma, and he visited the local king who lived in the capital of Magadha, in the Rajagriha, and he was so impressed by the retinue of the Buddha and by his teaching that he converted, and his Brahmins converted, and so did all of his household. And so there was a very vigorous and growing movement that the Buddha got moving, and during his lifetime. So it's thought that he became enlightened at about the age 35, and he taught for about 45 years until he met his death, or his parinirvana. And over that time, he covered a number of kingdoms: the kingdom of Magadha, the kingdom of Kosala, Anga. He taught people that weren't kingdoms, but were tribes clans like his own: the Shakyans, the Kosalans, the Malans, the Laishivans, And he taught all these people, and he covered something like 50,000 square miles on foot in his lifetime, and all the towns in that area that he covered appear in his discourses. It's really nice to actually see them on a map as real places. When you've seen them in a discourse, sometimes it's like a story. You can read it like a story, but you realise that actually there's reality to it as well. So, there's a couple of other things about the Buddha. He in terms of his teaching, he wasn't picky. He would teach anybody. It didn't matter what station they were in life, what their current beliefs were, what their gender was. He would teach all and everybody, from servants up to kings. And he was said to have supreme human qualities. So his fearlessness, his self-confidence, his patience with everybody. But it's also said that even his most his true nature eluded even his most advanced students. He is said to be unfathomable, like the great ocean. But all of his life and all of his teaching, it was very difficult to actually find a sequence of true events when how one followed the other. But and Sangha actually mentions that in the book that we showed you earlier. But he does mention three family events that are in some sort of chronological order. And the first was after he became enlightened, he did return back to Kapilavastu, which is the town he was born in, and he converted his father and his cousins, Ananda and Devadatta, to follow the Dharma. And 20 years later, he returned again and accepted his stepmother, Mahaprajapati, and other Shakyam women into the order. And lastly, in the last decade or so of his life, he had some difficulty with his cousin, his cousin Devadatta. Ananda, his other cousin, was his almost lifelong attendant. He looked after him very, very well and recorded a lot of what he said, in fact everything he said. But Devadatta got jealous of the Buddha's standing, and towards the end of his life suggested that he should retire and that he should lead all of his followers. To which the Buddha saw through that and didn't want to do that. And Devadatta tried to kill the Buddha in a couple of incidents, but didn't succeed and ended his life ignominiously. But the Buddha himself, his death or his parinirvana was when he was when he was 80 years old near a town called Kusinara, and he taught right up until he died. And in the night of his death, it's believed there were the three sort of areas or periods of time, 3 watches. And in the first watch, he received the local Marlans who lived in Kusinara. And attended to them, and in the second watch he received into his audience a spiritual wanderer called Subhadra, and again accepted him into the order. And lastly, in the last watch before he died, he left that for the brethren, the order, and there's some quite touching stories around that time. But essentially, what he did, he asked them. He said, "Is there anything else you need to know? If you're unclear at all, ask the question, and I'll explain it to you so that you know." So he gave them that offer, and then finally, in his last teaching, he reminded his followers that. Impermanent are all compounded things, and he said to with mindfulness strive on. That they were his last instructions to his followers.
Okay, thank you, Avaladana. It's always wonderful to hear, for me, the life of the historical Buddha. As I said the last recording, I'm particularly inspired by the historical Buddha. I think what comes through to me, every time I hear something different, but was just how heroic Gautama, as he was formerly known, was in, very courageously leaving very luxurious conditions. And just going from this luxury, being very kind of pampered, to apparently, a mendicant, a spiritual wanderer. And apparently the first bowl of food he had, he just gagged and threw it up because he was so used to good food. But he was absolutely determined. And, then another incredibly brave thing was to leave all his friends when he was practicing asceticism. Like he had the courage to recognize that wasn't going to work. And he just went it alone again,
Yeah, and he refused, didn't he, the leadership of the groups that he followed as well before that.
Yeah.
So he was just, he knew he had this sort of troubled, about our existential problem, and he wasn't going to put it to one side and just be taken over by prestige or anything.
Yeah.
Or he was going to find the root cause of the problem, which he eventually did.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that whole thing about very famously there's a story about the Buddha leaving a palace, the Buddha being a prince and leaving a palace with a chariot at dead at night and seeing what's famously known as the 4 sights of old age, sickness and death, and then seeing a spiritual wanderer. So that's quite a symbolic story that's sometimes taken as being historically true. But in hearing your historical account, it was more of just a quite human reflection, wasn't it? From what you said.
That's the way. That's the way I hear it.
Yes.
But I think the story is fine. It's like before when you were talking about the Jataka stories,
Yes.
you were talking about I don't know, parables or whatever. It's something like that, isn't it? When you, but the meaning's quite clear, and you don't. But I think it's very credible to think of him, maybe particularly because he was in such wealthy conditions. There's nothing else he could actually think of that he might need.
Yes.
And maybe maybe that was why he was able to leave it.
Or found life unsatisfactory, and and as you say, those 4 sights, they had like a mythical truth or symbolic truth to them that is quite inspiring as well. And I was thinking that the 3 Jewels was written in 1967. So he, of course, there isn't a lot of first-hand accounts of the Buddha from 2,500 years ago, but there is enough around. But later scholarship showed, more recent scholarship, scholars question whether the Buddha even had a wife and child. I was just going to mention or recommend this book, Gautama Buddha, by Vishwapani Blomfield, which is also a wonderful supplement that gives more updated scholarship as to the historic conditions. So in a way, it doesn't matter. Sometimes a lot's made of that, of the leaving the wife and child. But I think the important thing is he just left behind, the conditions as they were.
Yeah, to me, that and the thing that you mentioned about him, having his first meal and being sick and the idea of losing his lovely clothes and putting on a beggar's rags.
Yes.
That's physically, that's very difficult, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
And I think it's just testament to the strength of his conviction, that he was able to, and I think that's what I hear rather than the detail of exactly what he did.
Yes, that's right. And I, had the good fortune to go on a pilgrimage to all these sites where the Buddha had lived, to Lumbini where he was born, to Kapilavastu where his family was, to Sarnath where he first met those ascetics, and Bodh Gaya where he gained enlightenment. And just the mileage we covered and taking in that the Buddha walked that all on foot. After he gained enlightenment, it occurred to him to go see his friends. We did it by bus, that journey, and took hours. It was over 200 miles,
Wow.
and it's just kind of matter of fact. And he apparently never would even ride in an ox-drawn cart because he didn't want to burden an animal with his weight.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So he was very, extremely compassionate and kind.
I loved reading the chapter, actually, reading about the towns, that he passed through and the kingdoms,
Yes.
etc. And then looking at a map and seeing that, looking at the maps of the time and seeing these towns, physically where they are, and it does
Yes.
cover a large area.
Incredibly large.
And the peoples and the clans and the monarchies and
Yes.
all the different, the people he encountered in his life. It's really strange, actually. I was thinking to myself, how do I normally view the Buddha? Do I view him as a real person living, or as some sort of fantastic sort of spiritual being? And I suppose the answer is both.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think predominantly I look at him as the latter, and I don't as much think about him as being living a life with other people.
Whereas I just find it quite thrilling, this evidence, that he was this human living being that gained enlightenment. And when I was in Kapilavastu, there was an image of a funeral urn with an inscription by the family. They divided his ashes, and there's an inscription, this is dedicated by the family and relatives of the distinguished one. And there's something so human about the family having a portion of his remains, and there's just something I find quite thrilling, those human details. And when I read the Pali Canon, those different customs and the way he was greeted and the food he was offered to eat. I just find all those details of a living human being very, very inspiring.
I suppose the other thing that sort of occurred to me when I was reading it was how we all need direction. So he's talking about people who'd obviously had quite high spiritual attainments, but with little dust on their eyes, but they still needed to hear the teaching. They
Yes.
still needed to send out his followers to teach, to push them over, to give them what they needed to enlighten them, and he himself. I'm just wondering about how he was led through his life. So he went to the people that were renowned teachers, didn't he, at first? And then he followed, he followed the other practices, which were, if you like, established way of being. But at some point he left, didn't he? He went on his own, and he went on his own resources.
Yeah. So he's known as a Buddha because he's the first human who came across in our era that came across enlightenment and the true Dharma. So he found it on his own without a teacher, but he was very keen to teach it to others. And many people gained enlightenment during the Buddha's lifetime, because just to have someone of an enlightened being there, people, maybe just give a few teachings. Maybe people would travel miles and they would just stay with those few teachings and go deeper and deeper. Or sometimes people would instantly break into tears when they saw him, or have insight experiences. And it was quite an extraordinary period historically anyway, because that area of India was just full of spiritual ferment. There was just a culture. It was very affluent for the time, and it really supported this whole culture of teachers, spiritual teachers and traditions. And it's not surprising in a way that maybe there were optimal conditions for a Buddha to thrive in his own way.
And you makes you wonder. This is quite often when you read the sutras, that it tells how awed people are by his presence, you know,
Yes.
and
Hair stands on end. And
yeah, and his golden sort of aura, and
Yes.
you know, and it's just his beauty, you know, as a person, and I was just thinking about, you know, when we have rupas and things, you know, when the Buddha's no longer here, we need something perhaps just to help our imagination,
That's
to bring
right.
us to help us see the qualities which perhaps we don't normally look out for.
Yes, yeah, I think that's right. I think I was talking about that in the last week, you know, that people needed something to keep alive those enlightenment qualities and to make an emotional connection in the absence of a living human Buddha in the midst. And somehow that has happened for 2,500 years. It's come down to us and still having this incredible impact today. And I'll just say a last thing about, you know, when he died, it was, the way it was seen, he was still, enlightenment was still there. It was just his body that passed away. But, you know, his breakthrough into a state of being beyond conditions of impermanence and change, he'd already broken through into that. So, well, that's a whole other area that maybe we'll discuss in later recordings.
Okay, well, let's look forward to those.
Yeah, thanks again, Avalodana.
Thank you.
Great, so I hope you enjoyed that Dharma Night talk. So if you did enjoy it, if you're enjoying our videos, I just want to ask you or encourage you to think about making a donation to the Brixton Buddhist community. We're a UK charity that relies completely on your donations to run everything here. And yeah, if this was a class, a meditation class, there'd be a donation bowl that you could just put in £10 at the end of the night to help support the activities. But as you're watching this online, well, I just want to ask you to think about making an online donation. If you've watched 4 or 5 videos this month, maybe you might want to think about giving £10. So there's a link in the description below where you can go to our website and make a donation. And if you don't want to, if you want to keep giving and you don't want to worry about making that donation every month, well, you could just set up a standing order, a monthly standing order. That would be really, really helpful. Yeah, I want to suggest something of the region of maybe £10 or £20 a month if you're able to do that. And that would be really, really helpful and help us keep producing videos like this one. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourself.